The gunshot that sent Pearl Preston running from the church on her wedding day echoed through the town of Redemption Creek, Colorado, for years to come. It wasn't meant for her just a drunken cowboy firing celebratory shots, but it startled her enough to bolt from the altar, white dress billowing behind her like a surrender flag, leaving poor Benjamin Edwards standing alone, bewildered and heartbroken as the townspeople whispered. That was 1875. Now, 10 years later, Pearl sat at her dressing table in the modest home she'd built for herself on the edge of town, brushing her auburn hair with methodical strokes. At 32, the fine lines around her eyes told stories of a decade spent building a life alone, running the town's only bookshop while the whispers continued. Poor Pearl, too particular, they said. Too independent for her own good. She'll die alone, that one. She set down her brush and stared at her reflection. Tonight was the annual Founders' Day dance, and despite the whispers that would surely follow her, Pearl had decided to attend. Her green silk dress, her one luxury, hung ready by the door. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Pearl opened the door to find Abigail Thompson, her closest friend and the wife of the town's doctor. "Are you ready?" "Thomas is waiting with the wagon," Abigail said, her eyes bright with excitement. "As ready as I'll ever be," Pearl replied, reaching for her shawl. "Though I doubt there's much point in my going." Abigail clicked her tongue. "Nonsense, you can't hide away forever. Besides," she added with a mischievous smile, "there's a new rancher in town, bought the old Henderson place. I hear he's quite handsome." Pearl rolled her eyes. "And I'm sure he's looking for a young bride to cook his meals and bear his children, not some spinster bookseller." "You're hardly a spinster, Pearl Preston. You're just selective." The town hall was transformed for the occasion, lanterns casting a golden glow over the wooden dance floor. Pearl tried to ignore the glances and whispers as she entered, head held high despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. She'd grown accustomed to being the subject of gossip, but it never stopped stinging. "Pearl Preston, as I live and breathe," came a familiar voice. Mayor Wilkins approached, his rotund figure draped in his Sunday best. "Glad you decided to join us this year." "Thank you, Mayor," Pearl replied politely. "You know," he said, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "my nephew is visiting from Denver. Fine young man, works at the bank." 24 years old and looking to settle down, Pearl forced a smile. "How lovely for him." "I could introduce you." "I believe I'll get some punch," Pearl interrupted, moving toward the refreshment table before the mayor could continue his well-intentioned matchmaking. She was pouring herself a cup when a deep voice spoke from behind her. "Excuse me, madam. Mind if I get some of that?" Pearl turned and found herself looking up into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to a tall man with sun-weathered skin and sandy hair that curled slightly at his collar. His suit was well made but sat on his broad shoulders as if he were more accustomed to simpler clothing. "Of course," she murmured, stepping aside. "Thank you kindly." He took the ladle from her, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "Name's Matthew Anderson. Most folks call me Matt." "Pearl Preston," she replied, noticing how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Miss Preston, pleasure to meet you." He tipped his head slightly. "I'm new to these parts." "Bought the old Henderson ranch." "Ah," Pearl said. "You're the talk of the town, Mr. Anderson," he laughed, a warm sound that seemed to wrap around her. "Nothing too scandalous, I hope." "No, just the usual curiosity that greets any newcomer." "And what about you, Miss Preston?" "Are you a newcomer too?" "Hardly. I've lived in Redemption Creek my whole life." She sipped her punch, wondering why she was suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I own the bookshop on Main Street." His eyes brightened. "A bookshop? Well now, that's fortunate. I'm quite the reader myself." "Mind if I stop by sometime?" Before Pearl could answer, the band struck up a lively tune and Matthew set down his cup. "Would you care to dance, Miss Preston?" he asked, extending his hand. Pearl hesitated. It had been years since she'd danced with anyone. The last time had been with Benjamin during their courtship. "I'm a bit out of practice," she admitted. "That makes two of us," Matthew replied with a grin. We can stumble through it together." Something about his easy manner and genuine smile made Pearl place her hand in his. "Very well, Mr. Anderson. One dance." One dance turned into three, and Pearl found herself laughing more than she had in years. Matthew was charming without being presumptuous, and he moved with a natural grace that belied his claims of being out of practice. "You're quite light on your feet for a rancher," Pearl remarked as they twirled around the floor. "I wasn't always a rancher," he replied. "I was a cavalryman for several years. Then I tried my hand at a few other things before deciding to settle down and raise horses." "And what brought you to Redemption Creek, of all places?" A shadow passed briefly over his face. "I was looking for somewhere quiet, somewhere I could start fresh." Before Pearl could inquire further, the music ended and they were approached by Abigail and her husband, Pearl. "We were beginning to think you were avoiding us," Abigail said, her eyes dancing with curiosity as she glanced between Pearl and Matthew. "Not at all," Pearl replied. "Mr. Anderson, may I introduce my friends, Dr. Thomas Thompson and his wife, Abigail." Matthew shook hands with Thomas and bowed slightly to Abigail. "A pleasure to meet you both." "Likewise," Thomas said. "We've been curious about the new owner of the Henderson place. How are you finding it? It needs work, but the land is good." "I've already got a small herd of horses, and I'm hoping to expand once I get the fencing and barn in better condition." The conversation flowed easily, and Pearl found herself studying Matthew when he wasn't looking. There was something about him that intrigued her, a depth behind those blue eyes, a hint of sadness beneath his easy smile. As the evening wore on, Pearl noticed the curious glances from the townspeople. She could almost hear their thoughts. What was Matthew Anderson doing spending the entire evening with Pearl Preston, the woman who'd run from her own wedding? When Matthew offered to walk her home, Pearl hesitated. "People will talk, Mr. Anderson. Let them," he replied, offering his arm. "I've never much cared for gossip." The night air was crisp as they walked the short distance to Pearl's house. Stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet, and the sounds of the dance faded behind them. "I enjoyed this evening more than I expected to," Pearl admitted. "As did I," Matthew said. "Though I must confess I'd heard about you before tonight." Pearl stiffened. "Oh, nothing bad," he assured her quickly. "Just that you ran the bookshop and were independent. Is that what they call it?" Pearl said dryly. "Most people around here call it being foolish or stubborn." They reached her gate, and Matthew turned to face her. "I don't think you're foolish at all. In fact, I find your independence admirable. You might be the only one." Pearl glanced down at her hands. "Do you know what happened?" "Why people talk about me. I heard something about a wedding," he admitted, "but I don't put much stock in town gossip." Pearl took a deep breath. 10 years ago, I left a man at the altar, ran right out of the church when someone fired a gun outside. It wasn't my finest moment, but it wasn't right," Matthew finished for her. "The marriage, I mean." Pearl looked up, surprised by his understanding. "No, it wasn't. Benjamin was a good man, but I realized too late that I didn't love him the way a wife should love her husband." "Running was wrong, but going through with it would have been worse." Matthew nodded. "I understand more than you might think." They stood in silence for a moment, the moonlight casting soft shadows across Matthew's face. "Will you really come to the bookshop?" Pearl asked finally. "Tomorrow," he promised. "I'm in dire need of some new reading material." Pearl smiled. "I open at 9. "Then I'll see you at 9, Matthew said, taking her hand and brushing his lips across her knuckles in a gesture that seemed both old-fashioned and perfectly natural. "Good night, Miss Preston." Pearl watched him walk away, her hand tingling where his lips had touched it. For the first time in years, she felt a flutter of something that wasn't anxiety or regret. It was something lighter, something that felt dangerously like hope. True to his word, Matthew appeared at the bookshop precisely at 9 the next morning. Pearl had just unlocked the door, and the bell jangled cheerfully as he entered, bringing with him the scent of fresh air and leather. "Good morning," he said, removing his hat. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," Pearl replied, suddenly self-conscious in her plain working dress. "What kind of books do you enjoy?" history mostly, and adventure stories. He ran his fingers along a shelf of leather-bound volumes, but I'll read just about anything that's well written. Pearl guided him through the shop, recommending titles and discussing authors. She was impressed by his knowledge and the breadth of his reading. When he finally selected 3 books, a history of the West, a collection of poetry, and a novel, she wrapped them carefully in brown paper. "Will there be anything else?" she asked. Matthew leaned against the counter. "Actually, yes. I was wondering if you might join me for dinner tomorrow evening. I'm not much of a cook, but there's a decent restaurant at the hotel." Pearl blinked, taken aback by the invitation. "Dinner with me." "Unless you know another Pearl Preston who sells books and dances divinely," he said with a smile. "People will talk," she warned again. "Let them. I'm more interested in talking with you." Something in his directness disarmed her. "All right, Mr. Anderson, dinner it is." "Matt," he corrected. "If we're going to be friends, you should call me Matt." "Matt," Pearl repeated, liking the way the name felt on her tongue. The bell jangled again, and Mrs. Hollis, the banker's wife, entered the shop. Her eyebrows rose noticeably at the sight of Matthew standing so casually at the counter. "Mrs. Hollis," Pearl greeted her. "What can I help you with today?" "Just the new issue of Peterson's magazine, if you have it," Mrs. Hollis replied, her eyes darting between Pearl and Matthew. "Just came in yesterday," Pearl said, retrieving the magazine from a display. "Will there be anything else?" "No, that's all," Mrs. Hollis said, paying quickly. She paused at the door. "Oh, Mr. Anderson, I believe my husband mentioned you might be interested in joining the town council. We have a meeting next Tuesday evening." "Thank you, Mrs. Hollis. I'll consider it," Matthew replied politely. As soon as she left, Pearl sighed. "And so it begins," Matthew chuckled. "Is she the town gossip?" "One of several," Pearl confirmed. "By noon, everyone will know you bought books and asked me to dinner." "Good," Matthew said, gathering his wrapped purchases. "Saves me the trouble of announcing it myself. Until tomorrow evening, then. Shall I call for you at 6? Pearl nodded, a smile tugging at her lips despite her misgivings. 6 would be fine. After he left, Pearl leaned against the counter, her heart beating unusually fast. It was just dinner, she told herself. It didn't mean anything. Still, she couldn't help but wonder what Matthew Anderson's story was, and why a man like him would be interested in a woman the town had long ago written off as an oddity. The next evening, Pearl found herself fussing with her appearance more than she had in years. She chose her best dress, a deep blue silk with modest lace trim, and arranged her hair in a softer style than her usual practical bun. Matthew arrived precisely at 6, looking handsome in a clean suit, his hair neatly combed. He presented her with a small bouquet of wildflowers. "These are lovely," Pearl said, touched by the gesture. "Let me put them in water before we go." Over dinner at the hotel restaurant, they talked easily about books, their childhoods, and their dreams. Pearl learned that Matthew had grown up in Missouri, joined the Union Army at 18, and served until the end of the Civil War. Afterward, he drifted west, working various jobs before finally saving enough to buy his own ranch. "What about you?" he asked. "Have you always wanted to sell books?" Pearl swirled the water in her glass. "My father owned the shop before me. He taught me to love reading, to respect the power of words. When he died 5 years ago, it seemed natural to take over." "And your mother?" "She passed when I was 15. Influenza." Pearl looked up at him. "What about your family?" A shadow crossed Matthew's face. "I lost my parents young. My sister Eliza raised me, but she died of tuberculosis just after the war." "I'm sorry," Pearl said softly, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "It was a long time ago," Matthew replied, turning his hand to hold hers briefly, "but thank you." As they ate, Pearl was acutely aware of the glances from other diners. Redemption Creek was small enough that their dinner together would be noteworthy, especially given her history. "Does it bother you?" Matthew asked, noticing her discomfort. The attention, Pearl considered the question. "Not as much as it used to. I've had 10 years to get used to being talked about. What about you? Aren't you concerned about associating with the town scandal?" Matthew's eyes held her steadily. I've lived enough to know that people's opinions matter far less than their character. And from what I can see, your character is beyond reproach. His words warmed her more than they should have. You barely know me. I'm a good judge of people, he said simply. Besides, I'm enjoying the process of getting to know you better. After dinner, they walked through town in the gathering dusk. Matthew told her about his plans for the ranch, his hopes of building a reputation for breeding fine horses. It's hard work, he admitted, and lonely at times, but there's something satisfying about building something that's yours. I understand that, Pearl said. The bookshop isn't much, but it's mine. I've made it my own. They reached her gate all too soon. Pearl found herself reluctant for the evening to end. Would you like to come in for coffee? She asked impulsively. Matthew smiled. I'd like that very much. Inside, Pearl busied herself with the coffee pot while Matthew examined the bookshelves that lined her small parlor. You live surrounded by books even at home, he observed. They're old friends, Pearl replied, bringing in a tray with coffee and some cookies she'd baked that morning. They settled on the sofa, and the conversation flowed easily. Pearl found herself telling Matthew things she'd never shared with anyone: her doubts about running from her wedding, her dreams of traveling to New York or even Europe someday, her fear that she'd missed her chance at happiness. It's not too late, Matthew said gently, for any of it, isn't it? Pearl asked. I'm 32, Matthew, in this town that makes me practically ancient. Age is just a number, he replied, and happiness doesn't follow a schedule. When he finally left, well past a respectable hour, Matthew paused at the door. May I see you again, Pearl? The question was simple, but Pearl understood its weight. Yes, she said softly. I'd like that. The weeks that followed were unlike any Pearl had experienced before. Matthew called on her regularly, taking her for rides in the countryside, bringing her books he thought she might enjoy, sharing meals and conversations that stretched late into the evening. The town buzzed with speculation. Some, like Abigail, were delighted by Pearl's blossoming relationship. Others were less kind, suggesting that Pearl was desperate or that Matthew didn't know what he was getting into with that Preston woman. One afternoon in late summer, Pearl was arranging a new shipment of books when Mrs. Edwards Benjamin's mother entered the shop. Pearl stiffened. Though she and Benjamin's family had reached a civil understanding over the years, there was still an underlying tension. Good afternoon, Mrs. Edwards, Pearl said politely. How may I help you? The older woman fingered a display of stationery. I'm looking for a gift for my granddaughter. She's turning 16 next month and loves to write stories. Perhaps a journal, Pearl suggested, showing her several options. Mrs. Edwards selected a leather-bound one with cream pages. As Pearl wrapped it, the older woman cleared her throat. I hear you've been spending time with the new rancher, she said. Anderson, is it? Pearl nodded cautiously. Yes, Matthew Anderson. Be careful, Pearl, Mrs. Edwards said, her voice surprisingly gentle. Men have expectations, and you're not as young as you once were. Pearl felt a flash of indignation. I'm well aware of my age, Mrs. Edwards. I don't say this to be unkind, the woman continued, but everyone in town knows what happened with Benjamin. Some men might see you as easy prey, a desperate spinster. Pearl handed over the wrapped package with rigid politeness. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Edwards, but I assure you I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. After the woman left, Pearl leaned against the counter, her hands trembling slightly. Mrs. Edwards' words had struck a nerve. Was that how people saw her relationship with Matthew? Was that how he saw it? The bell jangled, and Pearl looked up to see Matthew himself entering the shop, his face breaking into a smile that immediately eased some of her discomfort. I was hoping to catch you before closing, he said, crossing to the counter. Then, noting her expression, is everything all right? Pearl hesitated, then decided on honesty. Mrs. Edwards was just here. She warned me about you, essentially. Matthew's eyebrows rose. Did she now? And what exactly am I supposed to be guilty of? Taking advantage of a desperate spinster, apparently, Pearl said, attempting lightness but failing. Matthew's face darkened. That's ridiculous. Is it? Pearl asked quietly. "Matthew, we've been spending a lot of time together." "People are talking, they think." "Well, they think you must have dubious intentions if you're interested in someone like me." "Someone like you," Matthew repeated, his voice low. "You mean someone intelligent, kind, and beautiful," the compliments flustered her. "You know what I mean. Someone with a history, someone older." Matthew stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "Pearl, you're only 4 years older than I am, hardly scandalous, and as for your history, we all have one. Mine isn't spotless either." "What do you mean?" he sighed. "I was engaged once in St. Louis. Elizabeth was the daughter of a businessman I worked for after the war, but when I told her I wanted to go west, to build something of my own instead of working for her father, she broke it off. Said she couldn't imagine living anywhere but the city." "I'm sorry," Pearl said softly. "Don't be." "It wasn't love, not really, just convenience and expectation." His thumbs traced circles on the backs of her hands. "What I feel for you is something entirely different." Pearl's heart skipped. "And what is that exactly?" Matthew smiled, a tender expression that made her breath catch. "I'm still figuring that out, but I know I want to keep seeing you, keep talking to you. I know that when I'm not with you, I'm thinking about the next time I will be." Pearl felt a rush of warmth. "I feel the same way." "Then that's all that matters," Matthew said firmly, "not what Mrs. Edwards or anyone else in this town thinks." He leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a gesture so tender that Pearl felt tears prick at her eyes. "Now," he said, stepping back, "I came to invite you on a picnic this Sunday. The wildflowers on the north ridge of my property are in bloom, and the view is spectacular." Pearl smiled, her earlier distress melting away. "A picnic sounds wonderful." Sunday dawned clear and warm, perfect for a picnic. Matthew arrived with his wagon, helping Pearl up onto the seat with a strong, sure grip. The ride to the Anderson ranch took them through rolling countryside, just beginning to turn golden with autumn. Pearl had never been to the Henderson, now Anderson property before and was struck by its beauty. A large white farmhouse sat nestled against a backdrop of trees, a barn and several corrals nearby. Horses grazed in the pastures, their coats gleaming in the sunlight. "It's lovely," Pearl said as Matthew helped her down from the wagon. "You've done so much with it already." "There's still plenty to do," Matthew replied, retrieving a picnic basket and blanket from the back of the wagon. "But it's coming along. Would you like a tour before we eat?" Pearl nodded eagerly, and Matthew showed her around the ranch. He'd repaired the house roof, rebuilt several sections of fence, and expanded the barn. Pride was evident in his voice as he explained his plans for breeding and training horses. "This is my favorite," he said, whistling sharply. A magnificent black stallion trotted over to the fence, his coat like polished ebony. "This is Midnight. I brought him all the way from Kentucky. He's going to be the cornerstone of my breeding program." Pearl reached out cautiously and the horse nuzzled her hand. "He's beautiful." "He likes you," Matthew observed with a smile. "He doesn't take to most people." "I'm honored," Pearl replied, stroking the horse's velvety nose. After the tour, Matthew led her up a gentle slope to the north ridge. True to his word, wildflowers carpeted the hillside in a riot of color, and the view of the valley below was breathtaking. "This is magnificent," Pearl breathed as Matthew spread the blanket under the shade of a lone oak tree. "I thought you'd appreciate it," he said, unpacking the basket. He'd brought fried chicken, biscuits, apple pie, and a jug of lemonade, a simple but delicious feast. As they ate, Matthew told her more about his dreams for the ranch, and Pearl shared stories of her favorite books and the customers who frequented her shop. After they'd finished eating, they sat side by side looking out over the valley. Matthew took Pearl's hand, interlacing their fingers. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about us." Pearl's heart quickened. "Oh, these past weeks have been the happiest I can remember," Matthew continued. "And I hope you've been happy too." "I have," Pearl admitted. "Very happy." Matthew turned to face her, his blue eyes serious. "I don't care what people say about your age or your past. I care about who you are now, the woman I've come to know, the woman I've come to." He paused, then said softly, "The woman I've come to love." Pearl felt as though her heart might burst. "Matthew, you don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I know it might be too soon, I just wanted you to know how I feel." But Pearl shook her head, tears of joy pricking at her eyes. "It's not too soon, at least it doesn't feel that way to me." She took a deep breath. "I love you too, Matthew. I think I have almost from the beginning." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Matthew leaned forward and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, but when Pearl responded, it deepened into something that left them both breathless. When they finally parted, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find you, Pearl Preston, but now that I have, I don't intend to let you go." "Good," Pearl whispered, "because I don't want to be let go." As the weeks turned into months, Pearl and Matthew's courtship became the talk of Redemption Creek. Some, like Abigail and Thomas, were supportive. Others were more skeptical, particularly those who remembered Pearl's first almost wedding. "She'll run again," they whispered. "Poor Anderson doesn't know what he's getting into." Pearl tried to ignore the gossip, but it was difficult in such a small town. What bothered her most was the doubt it occasionally sowed in her own mind. What if they were right? What if, when faced with commitment again, she panicked? One crisp November afternoon, Pearl was closing the bookshop when Mayor Wilkins's wife, Harriet, stopped by. "Just wanted to pick up the new Dickens," she said, browsing the shelves with forced casualness. "Oh, and to tell you that we're looking forward to seeing you and Mr. Anderson at the Thanksgiving social." "We're looking forward to it as well," Pearl replied, wrapping the book. Harriet hesitated, then said, "You know, dear, people are starting to wonder about Mr. Anderson's intentions." "You've been stepping out together for quite some time now." Pearl stiffened. "I wasn't aware there was a prescribed timeline for courtship, Mrs. Wilkins." "There isn't, of course," the older woman said quickly. "It's just that, well, at your age, and given your history." "Given my history," Pearl repeated flatly. Harriet had the grace to look embarrassed. "I only mean that people are talking. Some say he's just passing time until someone younger comes along. Others think he might be after your property. The bookshop is prime real estate on Main Street, after all." Pearl set the wrapped book on the counter with controlled precision. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Wilkins. But I assure you, Matthew's intentions are honorable and my property is quite secure." After Harriet left, Pearl locked the shop and headed home, her thoughts in turmoil. She knew the gossip was baseless. Matthew loved her, and he had no interest in her modest property. But the conversation had awakened old insecurities. She was so distracted that she didn't notice Matthew waiting on her porch until she was almost at the steps. "This is a pleasant surprise," she said, trying to mask her troubled thoughts, but Matthew knew her too well by now. "What's wrong?" Pearl sighed, joining him on the porch swing. "Just more town gossip, nothing I haven't heard before." Matthew took her hand. "Tell me anyway." She relayed her conversation with Harriet, trying to make light of it but failing. "It's ridiculous, I know, but sometimes I wonder if they're right to question what you see in me." Matthew's expression grew serious. "Pearl, look at me." When she did, he continued, "I love you. Not your bookshop, not your property. You, your mind, your heart, your soul. I don't care what anyone in this town says or thinks. The only opinion that matters to me is yours." His vehemence warmed her. "I know, and I love you too. It's just hard sometimes being the subject of so much speculation." "Then let's give them something real to talk about," Matthew said suddenly. "What do you mean?" He shifted on the swing, turning to face her fully. "I had planned to do this differently, somewhere romantic with flowers and moonlight. But I don't want to wait another day, not when you're doubting what you mean to me." To Pearl's astonishment, Matthew slid off the swing and dropped to one knee before her, taking both her hands in his. "Pearl Preston, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You're everything I never knew I was looking for. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" For a moment, Pearl couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotion. Then, with tears blurring her vision, she nodded. "Yes, yes, Matthew, I will marry you." He rose and pulled her to her feet, kissing her with such joy and tenderness that Pearl felt dizzy with happiness. When they finally broke apart, Matthew reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment," he explained, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It belonged to my mother. I hoped you might like it." "It's beautiful," Pearl whispered as he slipped it onto her finger. "Perfect." Matthew kissed her again, then said with a grin, "Now they'll really have something to talk about," and talk they did. News of the engagement spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire. Reactions were mixed congratulations from friends like Abigail and Thomas, strained well wishes from others, and outright skepticism from some. "She'll run again," was the common refrain. "Just like before. Poor Anderson will be left at the altar, mark my words." Pearl tried not to let the gossip affect her, but as the wedding plans progressed, her anxiety grew. What if they were right? What if, when the moment came, she couldn't go through with it? Matthew noticed her growing tension. One evening in late January, as they sat before the fire in Pearl's parlor reviewing a list of wedding arrangements, he set the paper aside and took her hands. "Talk to me, Pearl. Something's troubling you." Pearl hesitated, then confessed her fears. "What if they're right, Matthew? What if I panic again? I couldn't bear to hurt you the way I hurt Benjamin." Matthew's gaze was steady, his voice gentle but firm. "You're not the same person you were 10 years ago, Pearl, and what we have isn't what you had with Benjamin." "How can you be so sure?" she whispered. "Because I know you," he replied simply. "And I know us. What we've built together is real and strong, but if it would make you feel better, we could have a small wedding, just us and a few friends. No big church ceremony, no crowd of spectators." His understanding brought tears to her eyes. "You would do that? Change all our plans, Pearl," Matthew said softly. "I don't care how or where we get married. I only care that we do. The rest is just details." She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "I love you so much. I love you too," he murmured. "And I trust you, Pearl. Whatever doubts you have, I don't share them." His confidence steadied her, and Pearl found herself looking forward to their February wedding with growing excitement rather than dread. They decided to compromise on the ceremony, not the huge affair the town might expect for the only daughter of the late respected bookseller. But not a furtive, private affair either. They would be married in the church, with their friends present, but without the elaborate trappings that had characterized her first almost wedding. As the day approached, Pearl found her anxiety replaced by a deep, calm certainty. This was right. Matthew was right. What they had built together was solid and true. The night before the wedding, Abigail stayed with Pearl, helping with last-minute preparations and providing companionship. "You seem different this time," Abigail observed as they sat drinking tea before bed. "Peaceful?" Pearl smiled. "I am. Last time I felt like I was playing a part in someone else's story. This time it's my story, our story, and it feels right." Abigail squeezed her hand. "I'm so happy for you, Pearl. You deserve this happiness." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the February sky a brilliant blue. Pearl dressed in a simple but elegant gown of ivory satin, her hair arranged in soft curls crowned with a wreath of winter berries and evergreen. "You look beautiful," Abigail said, adjusting Pearl's veil. "Matthew won't know what hit him." Pearl checked her reflection one last time. At 33, she was hardly a young bride, but the woman who gazed back at her from the mirror looked radiant, her green eyes bright with happiness, her cheeks flushed with anticipation. "I'm ready," she said, and realized she truly was. The small church was filled with flowers and greenery, transforming it from a plain wooden building into something magical. As Pearl waited in the vestibule with Thomas, who had offered to walk her down the aisle in her father's absence, she felt none of the panic that had gripped her a decade ago. "Nervous?" Thomas asked kindly. Pearl shook her head. "Not at all, just eager to begin." The music started and the doors opened. Pearl took Thomas's arm and stepped into the church. Her eyes immediately found Matthew. standing tall and handsome at the altar, watching her approach with such love and pride that her heart swelled. She was halfway down the aisle when it happened. A loud bang from outside, a wagon wheel hitting a rut in the frozen ground. Nothing more, but the sound echoed through the church like a gunshot. For a split second, Pearl froze, memories of her first wedding washing over her. She felt Thomas tense beside her, saw the ripple of unease pass through the congregation, heard the murmurs begin. Then her eyes locked with Matthew's. He hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. He stood steady at the altar, his gaze never leaving hers, his expression one of absolute confidence and love. In that moment, Pearl knew with bone-deep certainty that this was different. She was different. This love was different. Without hesitation, she continued down the aisle, her steps sure and purposeful. When she reached Matthew, he took her hands in his eyes searching hers. "All right," he whispered. Pearl smiled, squeezing his hands. Never better. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew kissed Pearl with such tenderness that several people in the congregation were seen wiping away tears. The reception was held at the hotel, where friends and townspeople, even some who had been skeptical, gathered to celebrate. As Pearl and Matthew moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, she overheard Mrs. Holly speaking to Harriet Wilkins. Well, she actually went through with it. "I never thought she would." "Yes," Harriet replied, though one has to wonder why he was willing to take such a risk, marrying her at her age. "She's unlikely to give him children now." Before Pearl could react, Matthew's arm tightened around her waist. He turned to the women with a polite but firm expression. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by those nearby. "I couldn't help overhearing your concerns about my marriage. Allow me to put your minds at ease. I married Pearl because I love her completely and without reservation. Her age is irrelevant to me, and as for children, if we are blessed with them, we will be overjoyed. If not, we will still have a rich and fulfilling life together." He smiled down at Pearl, his eyes warm with devotion. "I would have waited another lifetime for her if necessary. Some things are worth waiting for." A hush fell over the nearby guests, and Pearl felt a surge of love for this man who defended her so publicly and eloquently. "Well said, Anderson," came a voice from behind them. Pearl turned to see Benjamin Edwards, her former fiancé, now happily married with 3 children. "Pearl deserves someone who appreciates her properly. I wish you both every happiness." "Thank you, Benjamin," Pearl said, genuinely touched by his good wishes. As the celebration continued, Pearl and Matthew found a quiet moment alone on the hotel balcony, watching the winter sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Did you mean what you said in there?" Pearl asked. "About waiting a lifetime?" Matthew drew her close, his arms warm and secure around her. "Every word. When you know something is right, truly right, time becomes meaningless. I would have waited however long it took." Pearl leaned into his embrace, filled with a contentment she had never known before. "Thank you for finding me." "Thank you for being worth finding," he replied, kissing her softly as the last rays of sunlight gilded their joined hands, the gold of their wedding rings catching the light like promises made tangible. 5 years later, Pearl sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching Matthew teach their 3-year-old daughter, Emma, to ride her pony. The little girl, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair, laughed delightedly as the gentle creature plodded around the yard. Beside Pearl, in a cradle, their 6-month-old son, James, slept peacefully, his tiny hand curled around his mother's finger. At 38, Pearl had thought motherhood was beyond her reach. The birth of Emma when Pearl was 35 had been unexpected joy. James's arrival had been an even greater surprise. Their life together wasn't always easy. Ranching was hard work, full of challenges and setbacks. The bookshop, now managed by a young woman named Sarah while Pearl divided her time between it and the ranch, had weathered economic downturns. They had faced drought, illness, and the continuing gossip of some townspeople who seemed unable to accept that Pearl had found happiness so late in life. But through it all, Matthew had remained steadfast, his love a constant that Pearl never doubted. They had built a life together that exceeded her wildest dreams, a true partnership of equals, founded on respect, understanding, and deep, abiding love. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch yard, Matthew lifted Emma from her pony and carried her to the porch, the little girl chattering excitedly about her adventure. "Mama, did you see? I rode all by myself." "I saw, sweetheart," Pearl said, smiling at her daughter's enthusiasm. "You're becoming quite the horsewoman." Matthew settled Emma on the porch swing, then sat beside Pearl, slipping his arm around her shoulders and peering into the cradle at their sleeping son. "How's the little cowboy?" he asked softly. "Dreaming of horses, no doubt," Pearl replied. "Like father, like son." Matthew kissed her temple, his touch as tender now as it had been when they first fell in love. "Are you happy, Mrs. Anderson?" Pearl looked around at their home, their children, and finally at the man who had changed her life with his patience, understanding, and unwavering love. "Completely happy," she said, leaning into his embrace. "You were right, you know." "About what?" "Some things are worth waiting for," Pearl said, turning to kiss him properly as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bright and constant, like the love they had found in each other against all odds and expectations. In the years that followed, the story of Pearl and Matthew Anderson became something of a legend in Redemption Creek. The woman they had called a fool for marrying late, and the cowboy who said he'd wait another lifetime, became an example of true love's patience, and the rewards of following one's heart regardless of convention or gossip. And when their grandchildren asked how they had known they were meant for each other, Matthew always smiled at Pearl and said the same thing. "When you find the right person, time doesn't matter. Love knows its own schedule." Pearl would always respond by taking his hand, the decades of their marriage written in the lines of their faces and the shared memories in their eyes, and say, "And sometimes the best things come to those who wait."